So I want to take just a minute here, and I want to just kind of look at the brain and the spinal cord, because by the time you get to where Dr. Peter and I are, we're so used to talking about this that we forget that everybody doesn't know everything that we know about the spine. So we're going to talk a little bit about it just in terms of, we have the brain, and the brain is the central computer of the nervous system, and the spinal cord is the network that actually sends, if you think about a computer, that actually sends all the messages to all the different parts of your body, okay? So what we do is we actually work with the brain and the spinal cord to be able to change the neural networks or the neural patterning of the nervous system so that places that you are stuck or have trauma or have a pinched nerve can actually release themselves and become free. Sound good to everybody?
Sure.
Okay. So that's the very basis of what we do. But the interesting thing about the brain is actually split up into 4 different parts. In this part of the brain down here, that's the survival part of the brain, okay? So that's fight or flight. That's when there's a tiger running after you and you either have to eat it, sleep with it, right? or kill it. So that's the survival part of our brain. We're only meant to be in that survival part of our brain for about 20 minutes a day. Now, think about that. How many of you are in survival only about 20 minutes a day? Yeah, right? Caffeine, sugar, fast lifestyles, pain, all of those things keep us in that survival part of our brain. The next part of our brain is called the limbic system. And the limbic system is the emotional control of our brain. Okay, so the interesting thing about the limbic system that controls the emotion of our brain, it also controls something called the emotional motor system. Now, that's just a lot of words to y'all, but here's where it becomes really important. The emotional motor system is all of the spinal muscles along your spine. So, when something happens that creates an emotional charge in your body, something that makes you have an emotional response, all of the spinal muscles along your spine actually tighten up. And so it's really important to realize that there's not a difference between just the physical and the emotional. They actually happen together. The next part of our brain is the intellectual part of our brain. And this is more the thinking and the speaking part of our brain. But has anybody ever noticed that when you go into a state of survival, it can be hard to think? It can be hard to remember words. It can be hard to remember sentences. Things that you know. All of a sudden, when you're in a state of survival and that freeze, you don't really know anything in that moment, right? Right? So that's the third part of our brain. And then the fourth part of our brain, the part of our brain that actually makes us different from all other mammals, is our prefrontal cortex. And this is what, when Dr. Peter and I talk about our higher brain centers, this is what we were talking about. That prefrontal cortex is where compassion is, it's where unity is, and it's where our connection to that higher power, whatever part of that, intuition, God, spirit, our innate intelligence, that's where that connection is. We are actually meant to run our lives from this prefrontal cortex. But most people run their lives from their survival part of the brain. And the interesting thing about the survival part of the brain is that it can hijack the other parts of the brain. So, for instance, somebody whose survival part of their brain is hijacking their emotional part of their brain will become really, really emotional. If anybody's ever been in a rage and all of a sudden you can't control yourself from a rage, that's your survival part of your brain hijacking the limbic system. Or if there's somebody else who is in their survival part hijacks their intellectual part, one of the things that happens is they just worry and worry and worry. The what if syndrome. What if this happens, and what if that happens, and what if this happens, and oh my God, what if that happens? So that is your survival part of your brain actually hijacking the intellectual part of your brain. What we want to actually occur is that your prefrontal cortex runs all those other parts of your brain. And when that happens, you're at a state of peace. You have this knowing inside of you. You have this clarity inside of you. You have purpose. You have usually less pain. And even if you don't have less pain, the pain doesn't really matter as much because you know you're on purpose and doing what you need to be doing in your life. Sound good to everybody? Yeah. And do we want more of that? Yeah. So.
Where does stress come in?
Pardon?
Where does stress come in?
So stress comes in because your survival brain only takes over when you're in a state of stress. Okay? So your prefrontal cortex, that higher part of your brain, will run what's going on in your life. May I use you as an example? So in your life, I mean, you've had lots of different things, but I'm just going to use one of those things. When you were doing well in your life and then your brother died, and when your brother died, it sent you into a state of emotional survival, okay? And what it did was it cut off those higher parts of your brain, so you couldn't get back to that knowing of who you are and what you're supposed to do in your life. And then what happens is that cycled back into a physical pain that got your attention and gnaws at you. Does that make sense? So that stress, the stress of the death of your brother, is for you the stress that created not all of it. There's lots of different myriad of factors, but helped that. Okay, and so when we talk about things to bring you into your higher brain centers, then we're talking about those higher thought, big concepts, big ideas, what we're supposed to be doing on the planet. How can we help people? Those are all prefrontal. Descriptions of prefrontal things that occur. Does that make sense? So, one of the things that I want to talk about just up front, because we were talking about the emotional motor system, which are the muscles that are along the spine, right? That when you're in a state of stress or a state of survival, and the emotion comes into it, then those muscles get really tense. And what happens is those muscles get tense, and nothing tells them to stop. So they become chronically tense because they don't have any way to dissipate the energy. Does that make sense to you? Right? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when we make that light touch on your spine. So I just want to take one of the things that we know, if you look at most modalities of network spine, most modalities, whether it be PT, traditional chiropractic, they're going to go to wherever it hurts, right? And they're going to put an elbow in there, or they're going to put electric stimulation on there, or they're going to make an adjustment in there. But what we found is that place in the body is already in a state of fight or flight. And because it's already in a state of fight or flight, if we go in there and do something to it, right, it may stop it short term, but it usually comes back. Anybody have that experience? Yep, right. So what Donald Epstein, who developed network spinal analysis, found is if he could actually go to a point in your spine that had a state of ease, that was not in survival, that was not charged and hijacked by one of those other parts of your brain, and if he made a light contact there, that information would actually go up your spine into your prefrontal cortex, and your prefrontal cortex can start to integrate whatever it was that created the original trauma, okay? So if you think about it in terms of a light touch, think about a quarter, okay? So if you put a quarter, the weight of a quarter on your body, look at the amount of room that it takes up, right? And underneath this corner, these all have receptors in here that are all sending information to your brain every moment. For example, if you've ever touched a hot stove, right? What happens? You touch a hot stove, then there's information that comes down to your hand that says, hot stove, pick up your hand. And so you pick up your hand, right? But then there's information that comes back up your spine and stores it in another part of your brain and says, don't ever do that again, right? So all the time there's all these messages that are going on. So if I take and I put the weight of a quarter here, then receptors are sending information all the way back my hand, up through my spine, into my head to say, wow, there's a weight of a quarter there. If I then push on it like that, then all of a sudden there's receptors all around that are gathering there to actually tell my brain what to do or what not to do. But if I go to a place that has a state of ease and I just make a gentle contact, no heavier than if I just touch my eyeball, then your brain has to go searching for just a couple receptors to find out and become aware of what happens and what's happening in your spine and in your body mind. Does that make sense? So the importance of this is that when your body, when your brain has to make that decision, then it can actually start to go, well, does this pain need to be here? What's going on the other side? Why is there pain over there? What is it that I need to be paying attention to? So those of you who've been in care for a while, have you noticed that you've become much more aware of your body itself and like where it is in space and how it is in space, and oh, this doesn't feel good anymore, but this feels a lot better, right? So those are from those light touches along your spine, because now your brain, which was kind of dumbed down prior to that, now it pays attention to those light different changes in your body and what's going on with it. So it's interesting because once your body actually gets that light touch, then it begins to make the change through the spinal cord up into the brain and back down. Does that make sense? So here I have a dime, so I want everybody to take a dime. And this is just to show. Now feel how heavy or how light that dime is. Every time that there is a stress on a nerve, the weight of a dime, it cuts off the nerve flow by 50%. So if you think about your brain and your spinal cord, and you think about the weight of a dime being on a nerve, it will cut the nerve flow down by 50%. Now, that may not mean anything to you until you put it right there where your heart is. Now, think about what would happen if the weight of the dime, something happened, a physical, mental, emotional, chemical trauma happened, so that there was something pressing on your nerve, and that can be a chemical pressing on it. It doesn't have to be a bone. It can be the emotional motor system actually pressing on it, that you have 50% less nerve flow going to your heart. Now, that's not a good idea, right? So if we think about that over time and all the different traumas that we've had in our life, we can understand why chiropractic care and network chiropractic care that makes you more aware of when the tiniest change happens in your body, that it's very important for us to be able to create sustainability in our own lives that way. Make sense? Yes, Dr. Peterson.